I need you to close your eyes for a second and picture a Saturday morning so impossibly serene, so perfectly bathed in the golden, honeyed light of a Charlotte, North Carolina dawn, that you can practically smell the fresh mulch and the distant, comforting hum of lawnmowers echoing through the cul-de-sacs. This is Whispering Pines Estates, a sprawling, manicured labyrinth of upper-middle-class suburbia where the driveways are pristine, the hedges are geometrically flawless, and the illusion of absolute peace is maintained with an iron, invisible grip. Standing in the driveway of his impeccably kept home is Elias Thorne, a 74-year-old widower whose posture is so rigidly straight it practically defies gravity, a man whose quiet, dignified presence commands respect from anyone with half a soul. Elias is not just a retiree. He is a man who spent 30 years bleeding for his country in the Marine Corps, a recipient of both the Silver Star and the Purple Heart, surviving 3 brutal combat deployments only to return home to fight an entirely different kind of war. Every single Saturday morning, without fail, for the 3 agonizing years since his beloved wife Eleanor lost her brutal, agonizing battle with cancer at Johns Hopkins Hospital up in Baltimore, Maryland, Elias steps out into the morning dew wearing his full, immaculate marine dress blues. This isn't a fashion statement, and it certainly isn't a cry for attention, but rather a deeply personal, fiercely guarded ritual, a documented therapeutic exercise prescribed by his Veterans Affairs doctors to help anchor his mind against the crushing, suffocating tides of PTSD that threaten to pull him under whenever the silence of the empty house becomes too deafening. He walks to the front yard, the brass buttons of his uniform catching the Carolina sun, and he gently, meticulously tends to a sprawling, breathtaking bed of deep crimson roses, the exact variety Eleanor cherished, planted directly over the sacred soil where he scattered her ashes. It is a moment of pure, uninterrupted communion between a hardened warrior and the ghost of the woman who was his entire world, a moment so private and fragile that to interrupt it would require a level of sociopathic entitlement that most of us simply cannot comprehend. And yet, the crunch of overpriced designer sneakers on the gravel shatters the morning peace, signaling the arrival of the apex predator of Whispering Pines Estates, a woman whose very existence seems fueled by the misery of others. Enter Beatrice Vander Wood, the undisputed, tyrannical president of the Homeowners Association, a woman who wields her clipboard like a broadsword and treats the neighborhood bylaws as if they were carved into stone tablets and handed down to her directly from the heavens. Beatrice has ruled this subdivision for 8 long, miserable years, utilizing a ruthless, calculated system of hyper-enforcement to terrorize vulnerable residents, burying them in petty fines for grass that is a fraction of an inch too tall, or paint colors that deviate slightly from the approved palette, all while mysteriously securing continuous approvals for her own massive, rule-breaking property expansions. She marches straight across the property line, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disdain, looking at a decorated American hero as if he were a stain on her perfect, beige-toned canvas. "Take off that ridiculous costume right now," she snaps, her voice cutting through the peaceful morning air like a jagged piece of glass, completely oblivious to the sacred nature of the ground she is standing on. This is a respectable, high-value neighborhood, and we have standards to uphold. I want you to really let that sink in for a moment, to truly process the sheer, breathtaking audacity of a woman standing in a man's own front yard, staring at a chest full of combat medals earned in the dirt and the blood of foreign shores, and calling it a costume. Elias slowly, methodically sets down his watering can, turning to face her with the chilling, absolute patience of a man who has stared down actual, armed enemies and finds this woman to be nothing more than a minor, irritating gnat. "Ma'am," he says, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely rises above a whisper but carries the weight of a collapsing star. "This is not a costume. These are the colors of my country, and I earned every single thread of this uniform through 3 tours of duty." But Beatrice, blinded by her own bloated ego and entirely consumed by her pathetic suburban power trip, actually scoffs, rolling her eyes and spitting back. "I do not care what you think you did overseas. This is America. We have rules, and your little dress-up game is driving down property values." She slaps a $150 violation notice against his chest, completely unaware that she has just crossed the ultimate Rubicon, targeting a man who has infinite patience, unparalleled tactical brilliance, and absolutely nothing left in this world to lose. While a normal person might have crumpled under the threat of mounting fines, Elias does what any seasoned military commander does when ambushed. He falls back, regroups, and immediately begins gathering intelligence, treating the Mecklenburg County Records Office like a forward operating base. Deep in the dusty, fluorescent-lit archives, he spends days meticulously combing through the original founding documents of the Whispering Pines Estates Association, bypassing the current, heavily manipulated rulebooks to find the foundational charter from decades ago, reading until his eyes blur and his fingers are stained with old ink. He strikes absolute gold buried on page 42, a beautifully worded, legally binding clause explicitly protecting patriotic displays, including military insignia and veteran commemorative activities, classifying them as permanent, protected community assets that cannot be overridden by any modern, aesthetic-obsessed board. Furthermore, his reconnaissance uncovers a massive, glaring conflict of interest. The original developer and the sole beneficiary of almost every single recent neighborhood renovation contract is none other than Apex Builders, a highly lucrative construction firm owned directly by Arthur Vander Wood, Beatrice's husband. Armed with this devastating knowledge, Elias files a formal, impeccably documented appeal, walking into the stuffy, tension-filled community center on a Wednesday evening with the quiet confidence of a lion walking into a den of incredibly stupid, utterly unprepared sheep. The room is packed, the air thick with the anxious, fearful energy of dozens of neighbors who have been tormented by Beatrice's regime, all watching as she bangs her gavel with a tyrannical glee, ready to publicly humiliate the old soldier. When Elias calmly presents the original charter, proving his actions are legally protected, the board members, a collection of spineless cronies terrified of Beatrice's wrath, exchange nervous, panicked glances, except for one woman, a rebellious, sharp-minded retired teacher named Margaret Sterling, who actually tries to speak up for justice. "We can't ignore the foundational charter," Margaret argues, her voice shaking slightly, but holding firm against the glaring eyes of the president. But Beatrice simply sneers, overriding the objection with a wave of her hand, denying the appeal instantly, and doubling the fine on the spot. But she doesn't stop there, because villains of her caliber simply do not know when to quit. In a move of staggering, unimaginable hubris, she declares a brand new, retroactive rule effective immediately, banning all military paraphernalia visible from public streets, completely unaware that creating a rule specifically targeting a disabled veteran in front of 50 witnesses isn't just an HOA overreach. It is a massive, highly illegal federal civil rights violation. The morning after the disastrous board meeting, the atmosphere in Whispering Pines Estates shifts from quiet submission to simmering, palpable outrage, and the war officially transitions from a defensive skirmish into a fully coordinated, multi-front assault against Beatrice's corrupt empire. Elias meets quietly at the Maple Street Diner, sliding into a worn vinyl booth across from Margaret Sterling, who has brought along a secret weapon, her nephew Julian, a brilliant, perpetually caffeinated forensic accountant who investigates corporate fraud for a living, and his younger brother Leo, a hyper-online Gen Z internet sleuth who treats tracking down digital footprints like an Olympic sport. As the smell of burnt diner coffee and greasy hash browns hangs heavy in the air, Margaret unloads a massive, meticulously organized binder containing 3 years of documented, color-coded evidence of Beatrice's selective, deeply biased enforcement, showing how she systematically targeted elderly residents and minority families with crushing fines while ignoring glaring violations committed by her affluent country club friends. Julian cracks his knuckles and dives into the public financial records Elias retrieved from the county, his eyes widening as he maps out a shocking, breathtakingly brazen embezzlement scheme where over $150,000 in neighborhood reserve funds have been steadily funneled directly into Arthur Vander Wood's company, Apex Builders, through phantom repairs and grossly inflated, no-bid contracts. Meanwhile, back in her sprawling, tasteless McMansion, Beatrice is unraveling. pacing her imported granite floors as she realizes that the old man is not breaking. So she decides to employ the most pathetic, cowardly tactic in the suburban playbook. She calls the authorities. Officer Marcus Vance of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department pulls up to Elias's home, expecting a genuine disturbance, only to find three elderly, decorated combat veterans quietly watering roses, as Elias had invited two of his old brothers-in-arms to join him in solidarity. Officer Vance, whose own father served, takes one look at the situation, removes his hat out of respect, and explicitly tells a furious, screaming Beatrice over the phone that he absolutely will not arrest American heroes for the imaginary crime of conspiracy to commit horticulture, warning her that filing false police reports will end with her in handcuffs. Humiliated and desperate, Beatrice hires a bottom-feeding, unlicensed private investigator to stalk Elias, a man who spends days hiding in bushes and interrogating neighbors about the veteran's mental instability, only to inadvertently photograph his own deeply incriminating notes, which Leo manages to digitally enhance from across the street, revealing Beatrice's true, sickening master plan to bankrupt and force out vulnerable residents so apex builders can buy their foreclosed homes at rock-bottom prices. In a frantic, wild attempt to find any loophole to destroy him, Beatrice issues her most absurd, hysterical violation yet, citing Elias for violating environmental health codes by claiming his memorial rose garden is attracting dangerous, aggressive wildlife that threatens the community, which, upon reading the actual citation, turns out to be a complaint about literal bees naturally pollinating flowers. This is the moment Elias calls in the heavy artillery, dialing his old friend, General Victoria Vance, a terrifyingly brilliant, retired military JAG attorney who survived the Pentagon and has zero patience for petty, suburban dictators playing God. Victoria arrives in North Carolina with a briefcase full of federal statutes, laying out the absolute, devastating reality. By interfering with Elias's VA-prescribed therapeutic routine, Beatrice has triggered catastrophic violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, transforming this from a neighborhood squabble into a federal discrimination nightmare that will bring the terrifying might of the United States Justice Department crashing down on her head. The media catches wind of the blood in the water when Elena Rostova, an award-winning, utterly relentless investigative journalist for the Charlotte Observer, shows up at the door, drawn by the scent of a David versus Goliath story. And within 48 hours, she publishes a blistering, massive front-page exposé that sets the internet absolutely on fire, turning Elias's fight into a nationwide rallying cry for justice. Pushed entirely over the edge of sanity by the viral backlash and the looming threat of a federal audit, Beatrice makes her final, most catastrophic mistake, slipping out of her house at 2 in the morning, dressed in pitch black like a ridiculous, geriatric ninja, armed with heavy pruning shears. Under the cover of darkness, she creeps onto Elias's property, her face twisted with a sick, hateful rage, and systematically hacks away at Eleanor's memorial roses, trampling the sacred soil, severing the beautiful crimson blooms, and finally, in a moment of pure, unforgivable malice, stealing the small, custom ceramic memorial plaque that Elias's grandchildren had painted. She thinks she has struck a devastating psychological blow in the shadows, completely, blissfully unaware that young Leo had anticipated her psychotic escalation and had secretly installed military-grade, high-definition infrared trail cameras in the trees the day before. The devastating, crystal-clear footage of the HOA president desecrating a cancer victim's memorial garden is immediately secured, backed up to the cloud, and handed directly to the police and the federal investigators, sealing her fate in a way that no expensive lawyer could ever undo. The sheer, devastating magnitude of the counterattack hits Beatrice Vanderwood like a runaway freight train on a gloomy Tuesday evening. During an emergency, heavily publicized town hall mediation held at the Charlotte Municipal Building, a massive, echoing auditorium packed to the rafters with furious neighbors, roaring veterans, flashing camera bulbs, and 3 major local news crews broadcasting live. The air is thick, electric, and vibrating with an intoxicating mix of anticipated vengeance and long overdue justice, as a high-ranking federal mediator sits at the head table, flanked by two incredibly grim-faced agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, their very presence instantly draining the color from Beatrice's face as she enters the room. She has brought along Cornelius Blackwood, the most expensive, ruthless, and morally bankrupt defense attorney in the state, a man who steps up to the microphone with a condescending sneer, attempting to spin a disgusting narrative that his client is the true victim, terrorized by a mentally unstable veteran whose trauma makes him a danger to the delicate fabric of suburban society. But before his vile, poisonous words can even settle in the room, General Victoria Vance steps forward, her heels clicking against the linoleum like the steady beat of a war drum, slamming a massive, undeniable stack of physical evidence onto the table that systematically detonates every single lie Beatrice has ever told. With surgical, terrifying precision, Victoria outlines the staggering federal civil rights violations, the deeply entrenched, racist selective enforcement, the massive financial embezzlement tied directly to Arthur's construction firm, and finally, with the entire room holding its breath, she plays the crystal-clear, high-definition night vision footage of Beatrice maliciously destroying a dead woman's memorial garden. The collective gasp in the auditorium is deafening, an overwhelming wave of pure, visceral disgust that completely shatters Cornelius Blackwood's smug demeanor, causing him to physically step away from his own client as the federal mediator reads aloud the incoming, inescapable charges of racketeering, wire fraud, and severe civil rights abuses. In a final, desperate, completely unhinged moment of narcissistic collapse, Beatrice lunges toward the microphone, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical shriek as she points a trembling finger at Elias, screaming that she sacrificed her life to build this neighborhood's prestige, and that he, a welfare case in a costume, is destroying her beautiful kingdom. Elias Thorne stands up slowly, the medals on his chest catching the harsh auditorium light, and walks to the center of the room, looking at her not with anger, but with the profound, devastating pity of a giant looking at an ant, and his voice rings out, clear and unwavering. "Ma'am, I did not bleed and sacrifice my youth for the property values of a neighborhood. I sacrificed my life for the freedom of an entire country. And there is a massive, fundamental difference." The room completely erupts, a thunderous, earth-shaking standing ovation led by dozens of weeping, cheering veterans that drowns out the sound of the FBI agents finally moving in, snapping heavy steel handcuffs around Beatrice's wrists, ending her tyrannical, 8-year reign of terror in front of the entire, vindicated community. In the months that follow, the healing of Whispering Pines Estates is nothing short of miraculous, as the suffocating atmosphere of fear evaporates, replaced by a genuine, warm community spirit where neighbors actually speak to one another, and Margaret Sterling is unanimously elected as the new, transparent president of an overhauled, completely democratic association. Beatrice is sentenced to a mandatory minimum in a federal penitentiary for her sprawling financial crimes. Her husband's corrupt business is completely dismantled and liquidated by the state, and the recovered, stolen neighborhood funds are beautifully redirected by Elias to establish the Eleanor Thorne Memorial Scholarship, providing vital college funding for the children of disabled veterans. Elias himself finds a profound new purpose, traveling across the country to speak out against the unchecked, rampant abuse of power within neighborhood associations, turning his personal tragedy and subsequent victory into a powerful, nationwide movement that forces legislative changes to protect the vulnerable from suburban tyrants. But as I look back on this incredible, exhausting saga, watching the newly planted, breathtaking crimson roses bloom in Elias's front yard, standing as a permanent, living testament to his enduring love and his unyielding courage, I am left with a lingering, deeply unsettling thought that I can't quite shake. We celebrate the incredible triumph of justice, the satisfying, cinematic downfall of a truly wicked woman who let a tiny sliver of imaginary power rot her soul. But we have to ask ourselves, how many other Elias Thornes are out there right now, suffering in silence behind perfectly manicured lawns, fighting lonely, terrifying battles against neighborhood dictators because they don't have the resources or the allies to fight back? Does true justice only happen when a story goes viral and the cameras are watching? Or is it our fundamental, moral responsibility as neighbors, as citizens, and as human beings to stand up for the quiet, vulnerable people next door long before the situation ever demands a hero.
Alright, and that is for today's videos. I hope you enjoyed it and found something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe and share it with your friends. Let me know your thoughts in the comment below. And thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.